One of the hardest parts about loving film photography is that you might fall in love with certain film stocks that are no longer being made. And there's one particular type of film I've fallen in love with, tungsten balanced film. Aside from Cinestill 800T and Kodak Vision 500T and 200T, these films are no longer being made. So what I've attempted to do is to take digital photos on my Fujifilm X-T5 of locations that I've taken film tungsten photos at, and try my best to replicate them through digital film simulation recipes. For the most part, I'm happy that I got about 90 to 95% there. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you how I created my digital tungsten film recipes with my Fujifilm digital camera, with a side-by-side look at film versus digital versions of those photos. I'm going to be showing these 4 locations that I have shot in 4 different tungsten films, and then comparing the digital tungsten recipes I made on my Fujifilm X-T5. All of these recipes or looks are made 100% in camera without Lightroom or Photoshop editing. However, you can certainly take these as a base and further tweak them. The way this video is organized is first I will be sharing the film versus digital comparisons. Next, I'll be providing the digital film recipes to use these for yourself. And last, I will do a live demo of how I build and tweak these recipes. So let's first look at the tungsten films I've shot side by side with the digital versions. I will be covering the 4 main tungsten films I've shot the most. Cinestill 800T, Fujicolor NPL 160T, Kodak Portra 100T, and my personal favorite, Fujichrome T64. Here are the digital tungsten versions of the Monte Carlo Bar in Minneapolis. The main 2 things I looked at when creating my film recipes is what the color temperature of the lights were and how those colors reflected throughout the scene's midtones and shadows. Now I'll be going into the film versus digital comparisons. Here you see Cinestill 800T. The biggest thing I noticed with this film is that the color temperature was standard for the tungsten range at around 3200 Kelvin, and the lights leaned a greenish yellow. One thing I will say about the Cinestill recipe is that it is fairly close except for the lack of the reddish halation you get from the film's removal of remjet. If you want to have that look, you'll need to do some further editing. Next we have Fujicolor NPL 160T. This color negative film had the most natural look for tungsten films that I shot. It was also the warmest at around 3600 Kelvin. Lights in this scene tended to be white or neutral tone, and then all the reflections in the shadows and midtones had a lot of red and orange. Kodak Portra 100T was often very similar to the Cinestill 800T, which makes sense to me since they're both technically Kodak-made films. I found that the Portra 100T did lean even more greenish versus the Cinestill had more yellows. This film shot was underexposed, but I will share more film examples later. And here's my favorite film, Fujichrome T64. As you can see, it's the coolest of the films with a color temperature at the lowest, around 2500 Kelvin. You see the blues, reds, and purples really shine in this film. The lights come out blue or sometimes icy white, with blues in the midtones and shadows. One thing I love about this film is how it contrasts very well with red lights. And here you can see all the film and digital shots with the film on top and the digital on the bottom. Next up is Belmont Apartments. I liked how this building had 2 different types of light, which helped further illustrate lighting differences and how the films responded to it. Here are all the film versions side by side. Again, you can see that Cinestill 800T and Kodak Portra 100T lean more towards the green-yellow. Fuji NPL is white and red-orange, and Fuji T64 leans blue, icy white. Now here are all my digital tungsten recipes for the 4 films. I think overall the light in the digital versions is very similar to how the film versions are. Next, I'll show each individual film versus digital recipe. I think one thing you'll notice is that sometimes each scene can have very different ways of interacting with light. The recipe will get you most of the way there, but if you shoot JPEG recipes only, you won't be able to tweak them later in Fuji X RAW Studio. Same with this one. The Fuji NPL recipe turned out a little more orange in this scene, so you might have to dial some things back. However, the lighting does overall resemble the film version. Here, I think the Kodak Portra 100T recipe stayed fairly consistent, with both lights matching fairly well. As well as Fuji T64, I think that recipe is the most consistent one I have shot from scene to scene that matches closest to the film version. And here again is the side by side. I think they all match fairly well, with the Cinestill 800T version being the one that is the most off from the film version. Next, here's the Basilica of St. Mary in downtown Minneapolis. These are the film versions. One thing to note is how the light color temperature changes with each one. Sometimes the light themselves look fairly similar, but how they cast light on the building and in the shadows and midtones is different. Now, here are all my digital film recipes for the Basilica of St. Mary. Again, the thing I pay attention to is the light and how it affects the midtones and shadows in the scene. Next, I'll show you each film versus digital version. Here you can see the film versus digital version of Cinestill 800T, and the biggest difference you'll see is the halation. Here's Fuji NPL 160T. I think overall the look is fairly good between the two. However, the lights leaned a little more orange in the digital version than how it tends to lean a little more red in the film. Further adjustments might be needed. This one you can tell has exposure differences, but the goal is to get as close as I could. The Portra 100T does lean a little bit more green. And once again, the Fuji T64 has that very blue look. And one thing I noticed in the scene is that there are two different colored lamps at the bottom of the frame, yellow and bluish white, and I think they showed up fairly consistent across both versions. And here again are all the film versus digital versions. I would say I'm fairly happy with how these turned out. My last location is the Jungle Theater. This is one of my favorite examples of showing the differences between these films. As you can see in the lighting of the sign, as well as how the concrete reflects the light, shows how these scenes handle the light color temperature. And here are the digital tungsten versions of the Jungle Theater. As you can see, this is where the Cinestill is more yellowish versus the Portra 100T is more greenish, while the Fuji NPL and T64 have been fairly consistent in how they look. Aside from the halation, the Cinestill film versus digital looks fairly consistent. The digital version might be slightly warmer, but you can tweak to your liking. The Fuji NPL continues to show that more white, orangish red within the shadows and midtones. I really liked how the Portra 100T handled this scene. The greenish lights have a great look to them. While the Fuji T64 continues to look so cool, even though it's the least natural of the films. I think this location had the most consistency across the recipes. What do you think? Now I'm going to get into the recipes themselves. Note, these will get you about 90% of the way there with the look. And for many, that's fine. My goal is to achieve as best as I could the look of these films in camera. But knowing many of these films are impossible to get 100%, especially Cinestill's halation. So first up is Fujichrome T64, which as I'm sure you've gathered is my personal favorite. But first I want to share a few more examples of the film stock. As you can see, it has a very cool blue look that contrasts very well with red and purple lights and signs in the scene. So here I'm going to show you my Fuji T64 recipe. Now I highly recommend saving it to a custom setting. And so I have my Fuji T64, but I'm going to show you all the settings I do. I would recommend having both JPEG and RAW so that you have the capability to actually make adjustments later. Next thing I do is select the Fujifilm Recipe Classic Chrome. I think this is the best one to use for this. Next up, I do the Color Chrome Effect Strong. Next, I go down to the white balance and pick Color Temperature 2500. And then after that, you need to go all the way over and do the white balance shift. I think the color temperature and the white balance shift are the two most important factors when building these recipes for nighttime, the digital tungsten film recipes. I have it set to -3 red and blue 7+. I don't really do anything with the dynamic range, but you can definitely make adjustments there. Next is the tone curve. I keep my highlights at 0, but I bring my shadows down to -2. And then color, I do +2. Those are all the adjustments that I do for the Fuji T64 recipe. So here's all the settings for the Fujichrome T64 digital film recipe. Next up is Fujicolor NPL 160T recipe. Again, this film is the warmest of the tungsten films I've shot. The lights are fairly neutral white, but it handles reds, orange, and purples fairly well in the scene. So for this one, I actually sometimes go back and forth between the film simulation, but I would either choose classic negative or classic chrome. For this one, I'm going to stick with classic negative. Next thing I do is I do change the color chrome effect to either strong or weak. I've had different results for both, but maybe start off with weak first. Next up is I change the white balance. As I said, this is actually one of the warmer ones, so I bring this up to 3600 Kelvin and then go over to the white balance shift settings. I have this at positive red 6 and positive blue 3. A couple other settings I change is the tone curve. Is I do this at -2 highlights and -2 shadows. Again, you can tweak this sometimes. I've actually brought the highlights sometimes down to -1, so this can be tweaked a little bit. But I almost always keep the shadows at -1 or 2. Color, I usually keep this somewhere between the range of +4 and +2. And there's really no other settings I typically do on this one. So here's the full Fujicolor NPL 160T digital film recipe. Next up is my recipe for Kodak Portra 100T. Here are some more examples of the film. I think it handles reds, yellows, and greens the best. This one I also kind of go between classic chrome and classic negative, but those are the two ones I typically do. Grain effect I keep on off. Color chrome effect I keep on off. Same with the blue effect. The main thing I change here is the white balance. This is now down to 3200 Kelvin, and the white balance shift is -5 red and -5 blue. The other things I tend to change is I keep the highlights at 0 and shadows at -1 or 2. And then color I usually keep at +2. So here's the full Kodak Portra 100T digital film recipe. And last, I want to share my film recipe for Cinestill 800T. I know there are quite a few recipes for Cinestill 800T out there, but I did my best to match up side by side. This film is, in my opinion, very similar to the Kodak Portra 100T and is still available to purchase. It handles the reds and yellows and greens best. For this one, I definitely do the classic negative. I've tested the classic chrome a few times, but I definitely prefer the classic negative for the Cinestill. I do the color chrome effect on strong or weak usually, but I usually do keep this on one of them. Next up, I go to the white balance settings. This is actually the same as the Portra 100T at 3200, but the white balance shift, I do adjust to red at 0 and blue at -5. Next up is the tone curve. I tend to keep this at a -1 for the shadows and 0 for the highlights. And then color, I usually keep this between +4 and +2. You could also play around a little bit. I have done more of the grain effects on this one. So you can do play around with the strong or weak and do the small or large grain. So I would say the Cinestill, this is where I play around with the grain the most. So here's the full Cinestill 800T digital film recipe. Now I'm going to show you a live demo of me building these recipes within Fuji X RAW Studio. So here we are in Fuji X RAW Studio. Now, if you're not aware, the way this works is you have to have the camera that you use plugged in, or the one that you shot with plugged in. So in this case, I have the Fujifilm X-T5 plugged in, and I shot this in RAW, and what I've done is actually done this in my standard profile. Now, I have saved profiles for this. So I have my Fujichrome 64T or T64. I have the Fuji NPL. I have the Portra 100T and the Cinestill 800T. Now I'm going to go back to standard so we can start from scratch and show you how I build one of these. So the way I usually start off when thinking about building one of these is going with, not with the film simulation first. Especially at night, I want to get the white balance right. So as you know, I did this through the color temperature. And as you can see, as you're picking the color temperature, it's going to change the warmth of the image, warmth or coolness of the image. So here again is the film version for reference. So I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth. As you can see, it's very blue, nice reds. Let's see if we can see anything else in the scene. Let's go back here. Now, not everything is going to be perfect. As you can tell, I think some of this side was not really matching up that well. And plus, there's more darkness. But the next thing I did was I wanted to get the white balance shift right. Now, actually, when I originally made this recipe, I was more kind of on this side. I had some very, around here, very blue, but it kind of leaned purple to me. And if you go back, this actually is going into almost like a teal or aqua color. So as I started to mess around with this recipe, sometimes I go kind of more around here. So this is the number that I landed on, the negative red 3 and the blue 7. But again, as you can see, you can kind of move things around to get different looks. But that's where I'm at here. Now I am going to go back and change. This is the Provia film simulation, but I had this on classic Chrome. So we could do that. Or let's see how, say, nostalgic negative. See how the blues of the scene, it just doesn't look like it matches well. Now if we do classic negative, it can kind of work, but I feel like the darks are not as good. So I like classic Chrome for this. And as I've done before, I've done the chrome effect. As you can see, the differences in the window here, I like that at strong. Now, the other things I did for this in the film simulation was actually bring the shadows down. So as you can see, if you do the shadows, here it crushes the blacks. And often I find that with film, you definitely want it between -1 or -2. I'm going to keep it at -2, or maybe split the difference and do 1.5. We can play around with the highlight tones, see what that does to the light. So I sometimes do bring this down. I think for here, maybe -1. Color, I feel like it needs to be a little more saturated, so I'm going to go with a 2, see what it does with the 4. I like it at the 2, or maybe even the 1. Just add a little bit more color to it. Now, the other things you could do is you could change the exposure up or down. I think if we're looking at the film version, kind of this area was a little bit more dark, but that's all personal preference. So that's just building from scratch. I think this is what it looks like. I think there's definitely a little bit more red in the window shot versus here. It does kind of lean pink. And sometimes you just can't get it all the way. Like I could keep messing around with this, but you might just have to like either put this into like Photoshop or something else, but this is the closest I can get just in camera. So as you can see, this is kind of pretty close to, I think, what I had before, but if I go up to my recipe, so here's how it is, and not much difference. So just a couple of other small tweaks. So now I'm going to build the Kodak Portra 100T recipe. Now, if you remember again, so I have it at ProVS standard. Maybe we'll start with changing the film simulation first. We'll do a classic negative, try that this time. And then again, one of the major things I noticed with that film is that it's quite a bit warmer. So Kodak Portra, I had that and the Cinestill at 3200. So that is 3200. It's pretty decent, but as you can see, it's definitely more green here. And so the next thing I would do is bring this down. So -5 blue and 0 red. This is what I had for the Cinestill. And this is what I had for the Portra 100T, -5 red and -5 blue. So we're going to try the color chrome effect. See, that just makes the scene a little bit darker. I like what it does. I actually like weak better and what it does to the windows here. See if we can do anything with the shadows or highlights. I'm going to bring the highlights down 1. I'm going to bring the shadows down 1 or 2. I like 1. It's looking pretty close, I would say. That's pretty close right there. I do want to bring the colors up maybe by +2, +4, maybe +3. As I mentioned, somewhere between 2 and 4 is what I typically keep this at. Now, let's play around. Actually, what I didn't do last time is do like the grain. You can play around with the grain. I don't always notice a huge difference. I think I noticed that a little bit more in the daylight, but we'll do strong, maybe do weak and small, just to add a little bit to it. The other thing you could do is something like bring down the clarity way down. It makes it like very kind of blurry almost, versus that brings the sharpness. Basically, the way I see this is it's almost like adding a pro mist, but I actually already had a 1/8 pro mist on, so there's a little bit of light blooming there. So I don't typically do that. So here we go. Actually, let's change this to classic chrome just to see how it looks. Yeah. So, and you can keep playing around with other film simulations. Obviously, the Velvia is way over the top. But for this, I typically do classic chrome. I have tried to see if some of the pro negatives ones can help. And sometimes they get pretty close. So those might be other good ones to try. I personally like the classic negative for this. Nostalgic negative makes it too flat. So does and even more so the Eterna. So I tend to stick with the classic negative. It looks the most like film in my opinion. So let's go up again. So this was actually more the Portra 100T recipe. So I'm going to click Portra 100T. And it is quite a bit different, and that's mainly because I had it now on classic chrome, but most of the other settings were pretty close. Now this is the Cinestill 800T, and this is where we change this here. I have played with Cinestill being actually even more so on the yellow side, but too far that way, it gets too red. So I keep for Cinestill in this area. But as you can see, one of the most important things I think for building these is playing around with the white balance shift. That makes a huge impact on the image overall. All right, so the last one that I'm going to do is the Fujicolor NPL 160T. Here's the recipe. And actually for this scene, it was a little bit too much. So I'm actually going to start from scratch and build it up again and make some changes. So the biggest thing, as I talked about for this one, is the color temperature, and this was actually warmer. This, I had it at 3600, And then this was definitely leans more red and a little bit blue. So I had this at red 6, blue 3. Here's the film version. So as you can see, the brick here and right here, it's more of a white color. So it's way more neutral. I'd call this more brown. Before on Cinestill, it was very Portra, and Cinestill was more greenish yellow, and on the T64 it was blue. So I would say this is actually matching pretty well here. Where I feel like the colors are a little bit off is more so up here. But we haven't changed the film simulation yet. So I've had this on classic chrome or a classic negative. And I think I like the classic negative more so. I think this color saturation is better. But let's look at pro negative standard, pro negative high. Yeah, nostalgic negative. None of these are really doing it. It's really only the classic negative that I feel gets that look the best. Color chrome effect. Honestly, we could probably leave this off, or we could keep it on weak. And then highlight tone, I would say maybe keep it. I really want to bring the saturation down a little bit, and then bring the shadow tones up, maybe down to -1. Now, in this instance, I think before I had this at a +2, but it might be interesting to bring the colors down a little bit. I don't know. I could go either way with this. Actually, I felt this was better at maybe a 1. So yeah, as you can see, classic negative, 3600, R6 blue. Here's all the settings. Let me go back up to the film simulation. And I think the biggest change here is actually this is set on classic chrome. So classic chrome or a classic negative can really get the look, I think. So either way you go on this one is not a bad option. Thank you so much for watching this video. And I'm curious, which recipe was your favorite?